Thank you so much, and thanks for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, well, let's just go right into it. Everything you wanted to know, maybe, about dragonflies and damselflies, but were afraid to ask. Dragonflies and damselflies are just one of a group of, of animals that we call insecta, class insecta. And they are really numerous. So there's lots of press, that's given into how many beetles there are, 350,000 species of beetles. We know that there's more insect species than there is anything else on the planet, 1.5 million described species, give or take. But what I find so interesting is that as we talk about the diversity that's out there and all the species that are yet to be described, dragonflies and damselflies are an interesting part of the conversation. We do describe, it's kind of an active time of discovery for dragonflies and damselflies. They're so charismatic and beautiful. You might think that everything was already known about them, but there's a steady, continuous rate of description of new taxa every year. And there's around the same number of species of dragonflies and damselflies as there are all of mammals. And so I mostly work on dragonflies and damselflies, but I also work on termites and cockroaches. And I would say that, like, in general, talking to people about my work, it's a bit of an easier sell talking about dragonflies and damselflies. People might have fond summer memories of dragonflies, or if they spend time fishing, if they're fly fishing especially, they might have associations with angler kind of lifestyle, fly tying and dragonflies and damselflies. And we're kind of used to seeing them around us and seeing beautiful insects around us. But when it comes to the roaches, or termites, those tend to have like a very negative visceral reaction that's elicited. And I think because for many people, the only time they really see or think about insects they often are thinking about the ones that they're interacting with in their homes, perhaps, which might be pest insects, although I would remind us that only 2% of cockroaches are pests. Because we're used to seeing a lot of insects that we don't like, especially in an urban area like where I work in New York City, that kind of gives people this false impression that maybe insects are just like abundant and numerous and doing okay. But we know that they're not, right? So there's been lots of data, and I'll talk more about this in just a few moments, but there's lots of data that suggests that insects are decreasing with a rate of decline that we've not yet seen. And so since we know that insects are disappearing, is this true for dragonflies and damselflies? Absolutely, right? So there was some initial idea that perhaps aquatic insects were doing better, perhaps than terrestrial insects, because we do know that we have, as humans, made decisions that help clean up waterways, and fresh water is a really big part of the story for dragonflies and damselflies. But when we look and do meta-analyses of a large working group for aquatic insect decline, we're working on this. When we look and do a meta-analysis kind of across all of the research that's out there, that's been published, what we see is, just as for beetles, just as for ants, just as for butterflies, we're seeing decline in dragonflies and damselflies too. So I thought I would just kind of set the stage to remind us where dragonflies and damselflies are in the tree of life and kind of the evolutionary history of insects. So using the fossil record as well as molecular data, genomic data, we can estimate the timing of the age of when insects first evolved. And this is important because to understand the origin of flight, or the first flying insects, it's really a story about dragonflies, because probably the first thing to fly was something that looked like a dragonfly or a damselfly. So when we do methods where we use transcriptomic data, genomic data, we use the fossil record, we put those together, we estimate that winged insects arose around 400 million years ago during the early Devonian, which, just as a reminder, really underscores that while there's no part of human history that hasn't involved insects being around, because we are just a tiny blip in the geological timescale, the majority of insect time has been in the absence of humans. And this is even more true for really old insect groups like dragonflies and damselflies that diverged shortly after that, or at least proto-odonates did. So we can use genomic data to kind of figure out how different insects are related to each other. And just to remind us what the insect tree of life looks like, There are things like silverfish and fire brats. Collembola springtails, we call these basal hexapods. These are recovered as sister to the winged insects. And then the winged insects are kind of divided up into two groups. The groups that have incomplete metamorphosis, non-holometabolists are called. This includes the dragonflies, things where in general, the juveniles look a little bit like the adults. A baby grasshopper kind of molts to a larger and larger sized looking grasshopper until it's the adult stage. And then there are the insects that have complete metamorphosis. Holometabolous insect, this is where you have an egg, a larva, a pupa, where there's like a complete reorganization of your internal and external anatomy, and then an adult, right? And this is really a strategy for compartmentalizing your life history strategy, where you have a juvenile stage that's really focused on growth and maintenance, and then the adult stage that's really focused on dispersal and reproduction. So we actually have a really ginormous tree right now. This tree that I just was showing you was one from about 10 years ago now. But now we have around 2,000 transcriptomes, and the relative positions of all of these taxa are the same. But I'll just zoom in to the base of the tree. This is where the mayflies and dragonflies, which form the Paleoptera, this is where they're found, and this is kind of where the dragonfly and damselfly story begins. So because they're probably the sister to all of the rest of the flying insects, we know that they probably were the first to fly. We know this from the fossil record. There are things called meganuridae, or the proto-odonids. They're also called griffin flies. These flew during the Carboniferous period. They were pretty big. They had, each wing was about 37 to 40 centimeters. And those are not modern dragonflies, but we think that they're like precursors to modern dragonflies. So before birds, before bats, before pterosaurs, before there was anything in the sky, probably the first thing that was up there kind of flying around clumsily, we think, were things that looked like a dragonfly. In the juvenile stage and in the adult stage, dragonflies and damselflies are voracious predators. They're actually excellent predators with really high success rate. The things that they attempt to catch, they catch with 97, 98% success rate in some species. And so this is important because that means the first insects that we're talking about in the winged insects were probably predators, and that any other subsequent feeding behaviors were derived secondarily. Dragonflies and damselflies all have freshwater lifestyles. So it's true that I mentioned they're in the non-holometabolous, the incomplete metamorphosis groups, where the juveniles sort of look like small versions of the adults. Dragonfly and damselfly babies look very different from the adults because they develop in fresh water. So females lay their eggs in fresh water. The nymphs develop over weeks, months, or in some cases years, in some cases many years, and then they emerge as an adult, and then the adult is terrestrial and kind of flies around. So in that juvenile stage, they're also eating other insects, but they can also take tadpoles and minnows and things like that. So some dragonflies and damselflies emerge from the water into their adult stage, and then they never leave the pond or the river that they were developing in. And others, by contrast, are long-distance migrators. So the other kind of extreme of never leaving the pond from which you emerge is to migrate across oceans. And there's several examples, and I'll talk about one in just a moment, that actually have individuals that can travel tens of thousands of kilometers as a single individual in their lifetime. We know that dragonflies and damselflies, a big part of, like, if you just were to hold one in your hand, I actually have a prop here. So if you were to hold, it's a little blurry. If you were to hold this dragonfly in your hand, the eyes are a really big part of the head, and vision is a really big part of the story for dragonflies and damselflies. We know that they can see lots of different colors, and we know that they are able to kind of perceive where their prey items are as adults, and they do interception style predation. So they can actually like cut their prey off at the pass, kind of like what a lion would do to catch their food. And part of the reason why they're able to see color, presumably, is because they use color for sexual signaling. So there are some dragonflies that have color on their bodies and some dragonflies that have color on their wings. And that color can communicate information, but it also can be used for thermoregulation. So they have two main types of color. There's structural pigmentation, and these are dragonflies and damselflies that might look kind of metallic in color. They have bumps and ridges like on their cuticle or skin, and when light bounces off of it, the angle of the light as it refracts off of the body, that is actually perceived as color. But then they also have color that is pigment granules. And the pigment granules in general can kind of migrate up and down in their epithelial cells to give them what we call a bright color or bright phase, or a dark color or dark phase. So if you ever were to catch a dragonfly in the summer and put it in the fridge for a minute or two, you'll notice that the color usually changes. And then they become, if they were blue, they become purple. If they were yellowish, they become maybe more darker brown or reddish. And that is a thermoregulation strategy. And then the last thing I'll mention is that as very old taxa, probably most of the families of odonates, of dragonflies and damselflies, they diversified during Pangea, when all of the continents were kind of smushed together into this giant supercontinent. And so as such, and in part because they're very good dispersers, they really do have a truly global distribution. They're found on all of the continents except for Antarctica. So if you were to talk to a beetle person to say that dragonflies are diverse, they probably would laugh because there are only 6,500 species. But that's the same number of species as mammals. And we tend to think of mammals as being very heterogeneous and varied. We kind of group dragonflies and damselflies into three main categories. There are the dragonflies, which tend to have kind of stocky bodies and they hold their wings out to the side when they're at rest. There are damselflies, which have very slender abdomens, and they have what we call petiolate wings, kind of stalked wings that they tend to hold behind their back when they're at rest. And then there's this third suborder that exists today only in China, the Himalayas, and Japan. And you'll notice it has kind of a stocky body like a dragonfly, but it has petiolate-like wings that are very similar to a damselfly. And there is some suggestion in the literature by Anton Suvorov and Seth Bybee's team that suggests that maybe this third suborder actually arose from an ancient hybridization event between dragonflies and damselflies. So we are really interested in understanding the evolution of dragonflies and damselflies because we want to understand dispersal and how that shapes speciation, but we also want to understand color. The dragonfly groups that have the most species also tend to be the most colorful, and they also tend to be the ones that have the widest range of dispersal capabilities. So just as if you were to look across mammals, we see a lot of variation between a panda and an ocelot, a house cat and a rat. The same is true for odonates, right? As you look across the 6,500 species, there is a lot of variation in size, in shape, in color, in the shapes of the wings, in the way that they fly, and in the habitats that they are found in, because these animals can be found in deserts, they can be found in the Arctic, as I'll talk about, in tropics environments, in temperate environments, and of course, right downtown in New York City, right? You can be in concrete jungles as well. So the Aeshnidae, or the darners, these ones are really commonly seen, especially if you are near lakes. If you go canoeing, probably you'll see these. These are early to come out in the summer, and they kind of stay up into the early fall. And there is some debate about whether or not these were sister to the rest of the dragonflies, what their evolutionary history was. These tend to be really fast flyers. These can fly about 30 miles an hour. And as you can see, their entire head is eyes, right? Their entire head is eyes, and it meets at a seam. This bright blue color that you're seeing in this dragonfly, this means that it was a very hot temperature. In cold temperatures, this is one of the dragonflies that very noticeably changes its abdomen to being purple in color. Another dragonfly group I'll mention are the petal tails, or Petaliuridae. And these are interesting because they're found really today kind of restricted just to kind of coastal regions. They're found in South America, the eastern and western parts of North America, and in parts of Australia. But there was somebody that worked on these in the 1970s, Perry Turner. He was doing his PhD thesis at Berkeley, and he became convinced that these are actually the main diet of Sasquatch, and that there's this lore or legend. I don't know if he started it or somebody else started it, but that if you were to eat one of these, you too would become Sasquatch. But also, that's the reason why Sasquatch are rare, is because this is their main diet. And so these are a very species poor group. There's a very small number of species, 11 species. And that's interesting about these nymphs is they actually make a burrow. So in North America, the burrows are very shallow, but there's some taxa, as I mentioned, in Australia, and to actually get to the nymphs in the burrow, a human would have to have your hand in a burrow up to your arm about to here. They're very deep, convoluted burrows in marshy or fen habitats. The Gomphidae or clubtails, these ones I think are really coveted by people who really like dragonflies. There's a lot of variation in the morphology. In general, the kind of bum or the tip of the tail has these expansion of their skin or cuticle that gives a club-like appearance. And sometimes it's very ornate and exaggerated, and in others it's very, it's not really clubbed at all. They tend to have really beautiful, striking color, and they tend to perch on the ground, although not always. And so this is one of the groups that has a really high number of species, around 1,000 species in this group. And then there's this large kind of superfamily called Cavalabiata. There's around 1,500 species in this group. And by far, if you've ever gone out to catch dragonflies, or you were just observing them through binoculars, or you happen to be near a lake of any kind, river, pond, what have you, a friend's swimming pool, if you saw a dragonfly, dollars to donuts, almost certainly it was a member of this group. This is the most common dragonfly in museum collections. This is the most common group of dragonflies that people report seeing. And it's in part because these tend to be territorial. So males and females will hang around a specific area. Males will kind of defend a territory, which might be like a twig or a bit of emergent vegetation. And so they tend to come back to the same spot. So if you're standing in an area and near water, you'll see the same individuals kind of flying around and then landing in the same spot. So they're easy to observe. And there's a lot of records on iNaturalist and GBIF for these taxa. This is, I think, by far the most commonly observed and collected. So we can make trees of life, just like we make a tree of life for insects. We can make trees of life for dragonflies and damselflies to figure out how they're related to each other. You can use all different types of data and taxa. And I'll just mention that, like, over the years, many people have done this. Our lab has produced several. And in general, we kind of all come to the same conclusion that probably damselflies were first to diverge. And then the third weird suborder that only exists today in China, the Himalayas, and Japan, that has a body like a dragonfly and wings like a damselfly, that probably came next, and then the dragonflies. So we have a large group called the GEODE team, which stands for Genealogy and Ecology of Odonata. And our goal is actually to try and get genetic sequences for all of the species of dragonflies. And this would be a first to have, I mean, this is what people do for mammals, right? We know we have kind of some genetic understanding for most of the species of mammals. We want to do the same, right? This is a tractable group to do that for insects. Right now, we've sequenced about 50% of all of the species. And our goal is to get about, as close as we can to 100, but at least 75. And a lot of what we're sequencing things that were collected 100 years ago that have been stored in museum collections. And so largely this is also kind of a testament to the fact that museum collections actually, not only do they store a lot of information about where species were found and when, there's actually DNA in there that can be used for projects like this. So with these data, we can estimate with fossils and this genetic data that probably damselflies first came on the scene around 225 million years ago. So think about it, like this is before T-Rex, right? This is before some of the big dinosaurs that you think of, and you think of very ancient things. Well before that, we have damselflies, things that probably looked a lot like modern families of damselflies that were already in the sky. We find that third suborder, the one that maybe was from an ancient hybridization event, body like a dragonfly, wings like a damselfly. It's sister to the rest of the dragonflies, and probably its story, it turns out, when we look at phylogeny, when we look at evolution, is a story about movement kind of across the continent of Asia, with the impact of the Indian subcontinent kind of probably affecting one of the species that is now today found only in the Himalayas. Probably there's more species in this genus, Epiophlebia, which is the single genus in this group. And there's hot debate on Facebook about this because people post photos from parts of their range that may be new species of this group. So this is an exciting group to kind of watch. And really, the more we know about what happened kind of in the evolutionary history of this group, the more we understand about the impact of kind of continents, continent movement, glaciation, and what have you in the evolution of dragonflies and damselflies. Now, I also will mention that there is a fourth extinct suborder. So I mentioned the three that you can find today, but there actually is a fourth one. And it looks a little bit like, from the wings at least, like a damselfly, but maybe it's something that's like this third suborder that's only found in China, the Himalayas, and Japan, where it just has wings that look kind of like a damselfly. It's called Cephalozygoptera, cephalo meaning head, and that's in part because the people thought these were just damselflies, that when the fossilization period happened, the heads kind of got squished. No, we don't think so. Bruce Archibald was the first person to describe this as a separate group, as a separate suborder. And it turns out this is actually just something very interesting about their shape of their heads, which are kind of cube-like instead of the kind of rounded head that you expect to find for dragonflies and damselflies. And we've been describing several members from this suborder. And then I'll just lastly say that for dragonflies, probably they arose around the same time as damselflies. So maybe 250 million years ago, the group kind of split. And then they both were really diversifying again, well before Tyrannosaurus Rex, well before some of the dinosaurs that you know and love. So we can try and understand the evolution of certain behaviors. I think that's part of what got me so interested in studying dragonflies and damselflies. And maybe what makes you want to know more about dragonflies and damselflies is just the behavior that they do is so interesting. Historically, people tended to focus a lot on male behavior, which is not necessarily surprising to the people in the audience, I'm sure. This is true for other animals too. And what we know about dragonflies and damselflies that is so unique is that males actually have two penis. So they have a main penis that's at the tip of their abdomen where sperm is produced and ejaculated, but then they kind of bend their abdomen up towards the base of their abdomen. And there's a secondary set of genitalia there. And that secondary penis, which we call a sperm pump or vesica spermalis, that secondary penis is where they put the sperm in, and then that is used to transfer the sperm to females. That's indirect sperm transfer because they're indirectly transferring the sperm. They're not transferring it directly from their primary penis. And that's one of the reasons why people had a hunch that dragonflies and damselflies were sister. They were right at the base of the tree, sister to the rest of everything else. And of course, our molecular data supports that idea. But what's interesting is that secondary penis is actually also used to displace the previous male sperm. So females can mate multiple times, and she can store sperm in her body. She has what we now think are two different strategies. She has short-term storage in her bursa copulatrix and long-term storage. How does she choose which sperm to put into long-term storage or short-term storage? We don't know. We used to think, historically, people thought last sperm that went in was the first sperm that she used to fertilize her eggs. And we know now that that's probably not the case. So whether or not there are chemical cues that she's using for decision-making, or whether or not this strategy of short-term and long-term storage is part of how she decides which sperm she uses to fertilize her eggs is of great interest. And in general, we don't know very much about the female's internal anatomy on a comparative basis, right? What we do know are things that don't involve dissection. And that is that when we look at dragonflies and damselflies in the water, we see that damselflies lay their eggs in plants, and some dragonflies do too. And that, by plants, I mean it could be emergent vegetation at the water. It could be a log. It could be that's kind of rotting on the side of the edge of the bank. It could be a lily pad. But then there are other dragonflies that you'll see that kind of fly along and then just tap their abdomen on the surface of the water and keep going. So the ones that are actually doing that kind of tapping behavior, they actually have lost a structure called an ovipositor. So anything that has to go in plants, you need to pierce the plant in some way, right? You need to make a hole to put the eggs in. The way that all damselflies do this, and some of the dragonflies, like the Sasquatch food, the pedaluridae, our petal tails, and the darners, the Aeschynidae, is that they have something that looks like a little knife, a little serrated knife at the tip of their abdomen. It's called an ovipositor, and they cut a hole in plant material and they put their eggs in one at a time. And it's time consuming because they have to cut a hole in plant material and be putting their eggs in. And as they're doing this, frogs are jumping up trying to catch them, birds are swooping down, fish are jumping up. So it's perilous, it's a risky business. But also you're kind of constrained in terms of your clutch size, right? By the size of the plant in which you're laying your eggs. By contrast, the two groups that have lost their ovipositor, they just don't have one. And instead they squirt out their eggs kind of in a clump. And then they tap their abdomen on the surface of the water and the eggs just get kind of squirted out into the water. Those are the two groups, the clubtails and the libelluloidea or cavalabiata. Those are the two groups that have the most species. And so there was this question, is it that maybe losing the ovipositor, right? Squirting out your eggs in a clump, it's faster. So maybe you're less vulnerable to predation. To being eaten by predators. It maybe because you're not constrained by plant material, you could have larger clutch sizes, and it does seem like that's true. Their clutch sizes are larger, but also maybe it allows you to exploit water that is temporary or transient, that kind of pools up after a rain or something like that, that maybe doesn't support plant material. So that kind of expands your niche space, expands the larval niche space of where the nymphs or larvae, we can use those words interchangeably, where they're able to survive. And maybe that led to the success of these two groups, why there's so many species of them. So one question we had was, well, how many times did this evolve, right? Did they lose their ovipositor more than once? Or was it just that these two groups share a common ancestor that lost the ovipositor? Well, if you've ever been like in a Costco parking lot, I would say is a very good place to see dragonflies that do this behavior where they've lost their ovipositor. Or if you're stuck in traffic, you'll see this behavior. So you don't have to be at water to see this behavior, because dragonflies and damselflies, they cannot distinguish easily between shiny surfaces, like the surfaces of a car or a car windshield, and the surface of water. So often in a Costco parking lot or on the turnpike in New Jersey, you see a lot of dragonflies just swooping down, thinking that they found a bunch of transient or temporary bodies of water, and they're just wasting their reproductive output on your windshield. But what you're seeing when they're doing that is this modified behavior, right? What we think is not the origin. All damselflies, which we think were the first things to diversify, they use plants for their egg laying. So this is a derived characteristic, and we want to figure out how many times it evolved. So we can look at the phylogeny, we can look at this tree of life, right? And we can see where the two groups that have lost their egg laying apparatus, where they fall. And if they're each other's sister, that means it evolved only once, but they're not. Instead, we see that clubtails, the gomphids, which have lost their egg laying apparatus, they're sister to the Sasquatch food, to the pedaluridae. And what that tells us is that the reduction in the ovipositor, where they just start squirting their eggs out in clumps, that evolved multiple times. It evolved at least twice, which is really, really interesting. The next question that we have, and there's a lot of them, is what's actually happening internally? Are both of these groups doing it the same way? Are both of these groups fertilizing their eggs the same way? Do both of them use their sperm storage the same way? By the way, how are females choosing the sperm storage? So many questions yet to be answered, but first we have to pose them and collect the data. So I'll just kind of zoom in on one of the groups that you probably will find in a Costco parking lot, wasting her eggs on your windshield, is this dragonfly, Pantala flavescens. And it is a kind of a classic example of a dragonfly that exploits temporary or transient bodies of water, because this is a long distance migrant. So Pantala flavescens, or the global wanderer, or wandering glider as it's sometimes called, it flies from rainy season to rainy season, and it's looking for little bodies of water. I have a colleague, Camilla Koch. She went to the middle of the Namib Desert, which is one of the driest places on Earth. This is where those Welwitschia plants kind of creep, they're very, very old plants, kind of creep their way out of cracks in the earth. She put out kiddie ponds, like child ponds with water in them. Pantala came. This dragonfly came, it found it immediately, and they started trying to lay eggs. So these are really good at finding kind of pools of water as they're flying high up in the air column. And as I say, sometimes they think your car is that. In the Arctic, there are dragonflies and damselflies that have to do the same strategy, only often what they're looking for is frozen for a big part of the year. So for dragonflies and damselflies in the Arctic, our biggest questions really isn't how are they finding the water that they're going to be laying their eggs in, but really it's how are they surviving in the water that they're in as nymphs, which we know freezes solid for part of the year. So with colleagues, we've been going to the Arctic quite a bit. We go in the wintertime and in the summertime, and we often think of the Arctic looking like this. And I will admit, in the wintertime, this is often the vista that we're seeing. But of course, in the summer, this is what the Arctic looks like. So you do have flowing water, and you're able to sample for nymphs of dragonflies and damselflies. And we're starting to really, use these data to understand the food web of what's happening up in the Arctic. So people often think of dragonflies and damselflies like the global wanderer, things that are kind of flying around the equator. And much of the diversity that we see is around the equator. South America has over 1,200 species of dragonflies and damselflies compared to North America, which is around 450 or so. So there is definitely more diversity as you go towards the equator. But even in the Arctic, there's quite a lot of species that you can find up there. So there's 48 dragonflies and damselflies that are found at or north of 66 degrees latitude, which is the Arctic Circle. And 6 of them, the ones that are shown here, actually are circumpolar, which means that you can find Aechna subarctica in the Yukon, in Alaska. You can find it in Russia. You can find it in Sweden, Finland, and Norway. You can find it kind of around this kind of region around the Arctic Circle. So what's interesting about these Arctic taxa, as I mentioned, is that they can stay frozen. And this isn't true only for Arctic taxa. This is true in northern Canada and parts of northern Europe as well, that are below the Arctic Circle, where water kind of freezes solid. This is actually a photo of my Nana's house. This is her boathouse up in northern Ontario, where the lake, this is Lake Muskoka, really freezes solid. And there's work that's been done by Gordon Pritchard and others that shows that in Saskatchewan, for example, if you were to take some of these blocks of ice, you can take the nymphs out and thaw them, and then they just start walking around. We think that probably snow kind of does help a little bit insulate some of these nymphs. Some of the nymphs are actually probably burrowed down into the muck. But some of them we know are actually frozen solid in this ice. What we think happens probably for the taxa that are in the Arctic is that for some of them, they might only have 1 year of development, but for many of them, they actually develop over 4, 5, 6 or longer number of years as juveniles. So what they're doing is they will be frozen, thaw, have a summer season where they're kind of in the water that is flowing, then they freeze, and then they thaw and are in the water kind of flowing. Frank Suling and others in Germany, they've kind of shown that actually feeding preferences, like dragonflies and damselfly nymphs in Sweden is where he did a lot of his work, they actually will stop eating kind of near the mid to end of August, kind of in preparation, he argued, for this kind of winter stage where they're actually going to have probably reduced metabolism and they're frozen solid. What's interesting about this habitat in the Arctic is that many of the lakes in which dragonflies and damselflies are inhabiting are actually bottomed at the bottom by permafrost. Permafrost is this kind of permanent ice layer. There's an active layer that actually freezes and thaws every summer, but there's this permanently frozen layer of kind of ice and dirt. And inside of that, there's actually a lot of stored carbon. But unfortunately, the permafrost is melting at a really alarming rate. So if the lake itself is actually the only thing holding the water in that place is the permafrost, when the permafrost melts, the lake disappears. So dragonflies and damselflies in the Arctic are losing habitat just by the loss of the permafrost, with the added negative consequence of permafrost melting being that, of course, that also releases stored carbon into the air, further greenhouse gassing the area. We lose also palsamires, which are other kind of like hummocks of permafrost that have soil and moss and different plants kind of growing on them. There's some cloudberries here, but they also can collect water and can be good habitat for dragonflies and damselflies. And as the permafrost melts, the palsamire habitat is lost. We also see in our field sites, of course, encroachment of seawater. As sea extent kind of is decreasing, we see a lot of influx of saline. And for dragonflies and damselflies in general, saltwater is death, right? There's a couple of species. There's one in New Jersey, Erythrodiplex bernice, that can kind of tolerate brackish water, but in general, dragonflies and damselflies cannot. And of course, we also see fires, actual fires kind of burning in the Arctic in our field sites in the winter and in the summer. So to understand the dragonfly and damselfly biology, like what's happening in the Arctic and how changes to the Arctic might be leading to risk, I guess. We've been sampling in Alaska, the Yukon, but I'm going to talk to you today about the work that we've been doing in northern Sweden, Finland, and Norway. So these are some of the field sites where we've been doing our sampling far north of 66 degrees. And this is work that's being done by myself, Manpreet Kohli, Dr. Manpreet Kohli at CUNY, Dr. Joran Salayan at Hampstead University, and RGGS graduate student Anna Eichert, who's in this kind of central video. So there's me with a shovel because I didn't have a good tool with me, kind of breaking into the ice to take out the nymphs that we're finding to figure out what their behavior. They often are frozen solid. The heat of our hand warms them up enough that then they start walking around in just a small number of minutes. We also have been sampling them in the summer. And of course, the summer problem is different, right? The summer problem, it's mosquitoes. There's a lot of mosquitoes, which is great because it's good dragonfly food. But if you don't like mosquitoes, then you're probably not going to have a super fun time being a dragonfly researcher in the Arctic because you get eaten alive. But the benefit is that you get to see all of this amazing life. So here are some of the things that we're seeing in our field samples. We of course see mayflies and caddisflies and stoneflies as well. But these dragonflies and damselflies, like the one in my hand, these are two different instars of the same taxon. So these are developing over multiple years. So again, these are things that are having this repeated freezing, thawing. I'll just say I can't resist just showing you a few shots of some of the things that are probably maybe more likely to be dragonflies and damselflies that you see. So let's zoom southward towards the equator. We do a lot of work also in the Guyana Shield, which includes the country Guyana, or what used to be called British Guyana. And there's a little over 200 and so species in Guyana. And these are some of the places where we've been doing our sampling. So we fly into the Rupununi, and the Rupununi floods every year from the Amazon River. Because it's part of the Amazon River, then the water level changes by 15 feet or so. And this dramatically impacts the dragonflies and damselflies that we see. So again, being a freshwater nymph is a really big part of their story. Most of the taxa that we're finding in Guyana have generations that are usually just 1 year, although not all. There are some that have longer than that. But in general, one of the risks for them is that the flooding of the Amazon that goes into the Rupununi seems to be happening at a faster pace than usual the last several years, and seems to be happening earlier than what we would have predicted. So we expect there to be kind of a rainy season, we expect there to be flooding, and then we expect there to be a dry season. But what we've been finding the last couple of years is instead the rain, like this year, came really fast, the flood came really fast. And of course, when we have rapid flooding, that displaces, and we don't really understand the impact of that yet, but that displaces the nymphs, because the nymphs themselves are just kind of clinging to rocks and debris in this water. This bridge behind my graduate student, Ellie, we went and sampled here in May, and by the middle to end of June, it had been washed away entirely by a rapid flood that was not predicted to have occurred at that time. I've brought my kids here multiple times. They really enjoy going to do field work with me to sample. They've only been to Guyana once, but they've been to the different sampling trips with me multiple times. And when I took my kids are now in university and junior in high school. And when I took these photos, this pond that they're kind of standing on, these water lilies, was almost completely dry the last time I was there, in a time when it should have been completely full of water. So these dragonflies and damselflies are also it's not just that they have rapid flooding that can cause too much water that kind of displaces them. They also run the risk of their habitat actually being lost by just being completely dried out. And just as salt water is death, dehydration is also death for dragonflies and damselflies. So I'll go back to this dragonfly that migrates to say that some dragonflies and damselflies tolerate these extreme changes by just leaving. And we consider them to be kind of climate canaries in general, because dragonflies and damselflies are excellent flyers in general. So when the going gets good in an area, they move there. There are things that used to only be found in Northern Africa and Southern Europe that are now well established in Sweden because it's warmer there. But it also means that when the area is poor, they will leave. So for some dragonflies, we expect there to be winners, right? We expect there to be dragonflies who, in times of climate change and environmental change, that they will just use their dispersal capabilities to be able to exploit new habitats that are more favorable for them. But that's not going to be true for every species. And there are some species that we consider to be specialists. This taxon, Pantella flavescens, we predict might be a winner, right? It already has a global distribution. It flies in giant swarms of about 100,000 individuals or more. And they, as I say, they kind of are moving from rainy season to rainy season. Pantella flavescens, which is the migratory one, exists in this tiny genus. It only has 2 species. Pantella hymenea is the other species, and we think it migrates north-south from Canada to Argentina. The juveniles develop in just 6 weeks. They have these like hairs on the surface of their wings, and when wind passes over their wings, they have a reflex to pick up their tarsi or their feet, and they get carried. So they're migrating really long distances, but sort of passively, because they're using the intertropical convergence zone, which is winds that go around the equator, to kind of be blown to the areas that they're dispersing to, except for on some islands in the South Pacific, like Rapa Nui, where they seem to have a modified behavior where they actually crouch down, presumably to avoid being blown out to sea, because salt water for dragonflies and damselflies is death. So we can use genetics, we can use DNA to figure out whether or not indeed they're migrating. Because if individuals from Japan are sharing genes with individuals from Guyana, the only way that males and females can share genes is if they're mating. It's if they're physically close to each other sharing genetic information, or have recently done so in their evolutionary history. And when we do that, these are called haplotype networks, where the size, each circle is a genetic pattern, and the size of the circle indicates the number of individuals that share that genetic pattern. And you can see that almost all individuals are in this one giant circle, one main genetic pattern. That means there's a lot of gene flow, whether we sampled in Senegal, in Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, whether we sampled in Australia or Texas or Guyana, there was gene flow being seen, which means that indeed individuals are mixing around and they're migrating. We can also measure their wings as like an additional piece of evidence about migration. And dragonfly wings and damselfly wings, they develop while they're in their juvenile stage in freshwater. They're kind of bunched up in these little wing pads. And they incorporate things from the water into their body, into their cuticle. So they incorporate hydrogen from the H2O of the water into their wings. And then when they emerge as an adult, their wings don't change over their lifetime. So their wings actually are a clue to where they were born, because the hydrogen in their wings is from the water in which they were a nymph. And it turns out hydrogen actually varies in its weight. It weighs more or less depending on where you are on Earth. So along a latitudinal and longitudinal gradient, you can have hydrogen that weighs more or that weighs less. So you can take a wing of a dragonfly that you collected, say, in Guyana, and measure the weight of hydrogen in its wings. And that will tell you whether or not it was born in water in Guyana or whether it was born in Australia or Senegal or Spain. And when we did this for the dragonflies, for the specimens that we sampled, we found that almost all of the things that we sampled were migrants. They emerged from water in a different country, but in many cases, a different continent from where we had collected the adults. So this is probably an example of a dragonfly that's going to win in a time of environmental catastrophe and change. It just will keep moving along that intertropical convergence zone, kind of flying around. I'll lastly mention another dragonfly that probably is maybe going to lose. This is the opposite of Pentella. It has a really restricted range. It's called Neurocordulia, or the shadow dragons. It exists only as these small number of 7 species. They're found in general in North America, on the eastern side of North America. But what's so unique about them is that they fly at night. We're not quite sure how they're navigating in the water and how they find each other. We don't really know very much about their vision other than that they're very good at seeing in low light conditions. And it's because they fly just in kind of the last 15 to 30 minutes before the sun sets, or even when it's too dark to read a newspaper. They tend to be kind of drab and boring in color because why be colorful, right, if you're flying at night? They're almost never collected. James Needham, who was kind of a famous entomologist in the 20th century, he talked about them being impossible to see in the dimness of the shadow. And that's true, because we sample them quite actively at my Nana's house, actually in Guyana, in Canada, in Northern Ontario. The same dock that I showed you in the frozen photo, this is what it looks like in the summer. There's a population that kind of flies around. So you can walk right out onto the dock and kind of see them every night. And we've done this. I'm not sure if you can see the dragonflies in these photos. They are impossible to see in the dimness of the shadow. But what it means for a dragonfly that flies at night, that really is used to flying at night, is that light pollution probably is having a negative impact on them. We don't quite understand necessarily the mechanism of how they're able to navigate, but their opsins seems like they have expansions in the gene families that are related to seeing in low light conditions. And we don't quite know how well they would do in high light conditions, if they're big strobe lights, or if the marina right by my Nana's house keeps their lights on all the time. We know that they tend to be very genetically isolated. The population that I was just describing from my Nana's house is a species called Neurocordulia emascanensis, which is the one that you can see with the blue and kind of purple colors. And they have kind of a restricted, unique genetic habitat that's not very diverse. So losing populations might mean that we're losing genetic diversity that is unique, very hyper-locally unique. We can look at their kind of what we call a niche model, or where it's possible for them to be found based on environmental variables like precipitation or temperature. And these are ones that were made for the different 7 species by Dr. Angelo Soto Centeno. And it does seem like right now there's kind of a range. The warmer colors indicate better suited habitat, and the colder colors is worse suitable, like less suitable habitat. But we know, like, for example, New Jersey, we haven't had rainfall or significant rainfall. We're in a drought, right? And so a lot of the Northeast has been in a drought, while other parts of the Eastern Seaboard have had rapid flooding. What the impact is going to be for a taxon that is so restricted, that is a specialist, and that flies at night, we think might be quite grave. I'll just, as an aside, other than the fact that we worried about losing Neurocordulia because it's an interesting taxon, we think it's actually the diet of several bats. So the things that are flying out at night when this dragonfly is flying are bats, and at least in the species that I was just showing you, emascanensis, there's around 8 species in the area in Northern Ontario that we think are probably feeding on this. We're doing tests to kind of confirm this, looking at fecal analysis to see what these bats are actually eating. But in general, when we lose these insects, we also lose food for mammals, for fish, for birds, for other animals in the area. So there's things that we can do. Probably when we think about insect decline and insect loss, we often think about butterflies, but this is happening with dragonflies too. And we need to really effectively communicate that aquatic insects need saving, right? Pollinators need saving for sure, but we need to know about the tree of life of insects. We need to know that dragonflies and damselflies have this important role at the base of the tree of life of insects, the first things to fly. And as aquatic, they really need this important freshwater habitat. I live in New Jersey. I work in New York City. And a big part of the discussion that we have is about reducing light pollution, reducing noise pollution, heat islands. It's all about terrestrial insects, but we need to be making decisions that really impact aquatic insects as well. And I would argue that like New Yorkers and most of us are really just thinking still about pest management insects and not really thinking about things that are in freshwater. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I went too fast with my click, but I was going to say, of course, in New York City, there's systemic racism that's kind of shaped who gets to have access to green spaces. And so that really shapes the types of insects that people see, depending on where historically people of color were kind of segregated in parts of the city, so that you might be more likely to only see pest species rather than dragonflies flying around water. So all of the questions that we have about insect decline, I feel like we need to really frame them to be broader, to include both terrestrial and aquatic insects like dragonflies and damselflies. And the things that we recommend doing, like getting rid of lawns and kind of making ourselves less reliant on cars, having pollinator gardens, all of those things benefit aquatic insects like dragonflies and damselflies because they increase the amount of food that dragonflies and damselflies are eating. Because again, they're predators. So they're eating the beautiful things that are going to be coming to your garden as you make them. Light pollution, as I mentioned, we know this affects things like fireflies. This affects things that are night flying, things like moths. It also affects things like the shadow dragon, like these dragonflies that are flying at night. I want to say that for dragonflies and damselflies, like all aquatic insects, we really need more people. There's a lot of people who are focusing on bees, and so they should. There are a lot of people that are focused on butterflies, and so they should. But we really need more people to be spending time working on saving aquatic insects, documenting populations, figuring out which species are found where, and what the threats are that we might think might be making them vulnerable. So I'm going to give a plug. I think we should all vote. So if you're thinking like, what group can I try and work on to save? How can I try and help saving insects? I vote for dragonflies. That's the one that we should all, put our time in to work on, because their dragonflies are disappearing and they need our help. If anybody is going to be at the Entomological Society of America meeting, we're actually going to be having a workshop, and some of the people from the aquatic kind of biomonitoring group will be there. There's also a QR code here that you could use to find out more information in general about the kind of coordination network that's looking at insect decline and insect loss. We'd love your opinions, your input, and if you want to join us, we'd love it if you joined. And with that, hopefully I'll have time for questions and answer any dragonfly or insect loss questions you might have.
Thank you so much. I learned an incredible amount of information, and we have a lot of great questions coming in. So I'm just going to dive right in, and I'm actually going to start with one of our staff, Caitlin, who is one of our staff in New Mexico. Hi, Caitlin. Her question is, are there any truly nocturnal dragonflies or damselflies, or are they all strictly crepuscular?
Good question. We do light trapping at night for roaches and some things. And we see things like erythemis, which is kind of some would call a very boring green dragonfly that you can find in the Northeast here. Sometimes they come to light. But we don't know if it happens to be that we're moving things around and rustling and they get startled and then they end up just standing on our sheet, or whether they're actually flying at night. We don't know. There's no dragonfly or damselfly that's classified as nocturnal. But we also don't know what the shadow dragons are doing. We know that if I go down when my Nana's watching Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, I'm able to see these shadow dragons, and then it seems like they leave. And the literature supports that too. After 30 minutes, they go. But where do they go? Maybe they actually go and fly somewhere. The dogma is that they probably just go and perch somewhere in the trees. We don't actually know because they're too small to have radio transmitters on them. So we don't actually know what they do.
Awesome. Good question. All right. Taylor is wondering why damselflies have such large eyes.
Oh, that's a good question. I wouldn't say that they have larger eyes necessarily relative to their head size than some other dragonflies, but they do have very beady eyes, and so they're very noticeably beady. In part, we think that they tend to be very slender and very small, so their eyes are kind of positioned in a way that allows them to see the widest range because they're looking for each other, but they're also looking, to watch out for predators. And so that a big part of when we talk about dragonfly eyes in terms of their position, the argument is always it has something to do with finding a mate or avoiding predators. So that probably is a big reason. What we see is that some dragonflies have their eyes touch each other, and damselflies tend to have their eyes apart. But even for damselflies, some of them are this far apart and some of them are this far apart. And we don't necessarily know what that actually does in terms of their vision.
All right. Barbara and a few other people were asking about outdoor ponds in their yard. And specifically, Barbara has a pond. There's no fish, just plants. But does water removal in the spring affect survival of dragonflies and damselflies?
Good question. The British Dragonfly Society would argue that everyone should have a water feature because if you build it, they'll come. In the United States, because of mosquito control suggestions and guidance from Mosquito County Commission, we don't tend to advocate having water features. But in other parts of the world, that's actually a very common strategy to actually get rid of mosquitoes because dragonflies eat mosquitoes, both in juvenile stages and in adult stages. And there's even a new book that came out this year that's gardening for dragonflies that includes how to make a water feature. So it's great that you already have one. Draining the water, if you drain it completely, then yes, that would negatively impact them. But if you drain it, as many people do, so that you're down to just a couple of centimeters, they usually can just hunker down in there for some time. Depends on how long you have it drained for, but they usually should be okay. And there probably are some species that you have in your pond that develop over multiple years, but you probably also have things like the global wanderer that develops in 6 weeks that probably wouldn't be affected at all.
I've also heard that maybe this is a naive question for dragonflies, but some sort of movement in the water helps reduce mosquito larvae because they like stagnant water. So would adding movement to the water impact dragonflies?
There are some dragonflies that really need to have high oxygen content, but they probably wouldn't be the ones that would colonize your pond. So the ones that I mentioned in that group that has 1,500 species that's most commonly collected and observed, those are the ones that will colonize your pond or your water feature. And those tend to be okay in what we call lentic or still water. And as an aside, mosquito larvae, also some tadpoles like Hyla, for example, they've done experiments for lots of animals that live in fresh water. If there are dragonflies in them, they actually change their behavior because they're so scared of them. So even just having dragonflies in there for a short time will temporarily change the behavior of anything else that's in your pond, including mosquitoes, which you don't really want, doing well in your pond.
Yeah, it's interesting. Mosquitoes are just really the answer.
Yeah.
To a lot
They
of
do,
things.
yeah. They successfully reduce the number of Anopheles and Aedes aegypti mosquitoes as well. That's been shown, but they just don't like to breed on command well enough that you could use them for malaria control. But people have tried in the past. They're that good at controlling mosquito populations.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mhm.
Susan's asking a question for Kayan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Wants to know, how deep do dragonflies dive in order to catch their prey? In water, I should have.
No, that's a great question. And it's interesting because they don't really dive. So dragonflies and damselflies in general are kind of what we call sit and wait predators. So they tend to sit, some are clinging to rocks, some are just kind of floating in the water just above the ground. Some actually conceal themselves by covering themselves with mud or muck, and some are in and amongst the vegetation, like the roots. And they sit, their eyes are really big even when they're babies. And when they see something coming, they have a mouth, their jaws are right here, but they have this little mouth part that's like this called a labial mask. And it works on hydraulics. So they kind of shunt blood into this and it makes it shoot out very, very fast. So they go like this, grab the food and then bring it back and then they eat it. So their strategy isn't to kind of swim after the food, but it's to sit and wait and have a very fast mouth part that can just grab it like that and then bring it back to their mouth to eat. One exception is that there are some dragonflies that can so damselflies breathe by having gills that are like these little petal-like things out their bum. And that's how they do gas exchange. That's how they breathe underwater. But dragonflies have their breathing tubes in their bum. And so they're called rectal pads. And so they can kind of like relax their bum and then let water in. And then they can like squirt it out of their bum really, really fast. And it shoots the water out. And then that basically is jet propulsion. So the dragonfly goes woof like that really fast. So even though they're mostly sit and wait predators, if they saw something they really wanted to try and catch, they can do that. They can relax their bum, put a little water in it, and then squirt it out really fast and go really fast towards the food item and try and catch it with their mouth parts. Still like this.
Very interesting.
Mm.
Vince is wondering, could you talk about the methods that males use to guard females?
So there's two main categories we call contact guarding and non-contact guarding. Non-contact guarding usually means that the males kind of just hang around the female after they finish mating. When they mate, they're usually together. The females bring her abdomen up to the secondary penis, the secondary genitalia, and they're together for a while because the male has to scrape out the previous male sperm and then transfer the sperm. Then they release, and the female will go immediately to the water usually to start laying her eggs, and the male will just kind of hang around. Sometimes they perch somewhere, sometimes they hover over the female, and then what they're doing is they're looking for other males that come to try and take the female away, and they chase them away. That's called non-contact guarding. Contact guarding, by contrast, is where males and females do this mating behavior, but then they fly together, what we call in tandem. They fly together to the water, and the male stays attached to the female. So they were like this. The male is attached to the female while the female lays her eggs. And in some cases, the male actually will force the female under the water to kind of lay her eggs in some of the damselfly species. Contact guarding, they still sometimes will let go of the female to chase away males, but then they'll clasp her again. And contact guarding is really interesting because when they fly together, it's very hard for them to fly because their wings are have been selected for the body mass of the animal. The wing is able to carry your weight, right? But now there's two that are flying. And in some cases, the male doesn't flap its wings and the female has to do all the flying. In some cases, the female doesn't flap her wings and the male has to do all the flying and carry the weight of two animals, which is really interesting. So I would say contact guarding and non-contact guarding it's hard to say that one group does one or the other because there's lots of examples of families or genera that have both contact guarders and non-contact guarders, depending on the species.
Interesting. Scott wants to know, are you seeing any evolutionary changes to dragonflies and damselflies as a result of climate change, or are they mainly migrating or dispersing as you discussed?
It's a good question, Scott. I mean, as climate canaries, the idea is that they are moving, right, to new areas, not necessarily even far away, but to new areas, new habitat. So that can be a strategy for some taxa. Other species are just being lost, and we don't know if they're going somewhere. So there's work that's been done. Joran Salea, my colleague, does a lot of work on forest dragonflies and damselflies, and he is seeing kind of turnover, species turnover, where the community itself is actually changing, and often you lose specialists and gain generalists, although we don't know that that's a trend necessarily across all habitats and across all species, but that's what Joran has found. But we also see that, even if you're not moving far, take, for example, the blue dasher, Pachydipplex, another dragonfly that people would have said was a super snooze, like super boring. Nobody cares about it. It's found, you can find it anywhere, USA and Canada. Well, it turns out maybe it actually migrates, and they were in that big swarm of dragonflies that landed in Rhode Island this summer that people were on the news about. That actually doesn't go very far. But what it's starting to do is exploit new habitats, and the habitat that it's exploiting in places like Nevada, like in Las Vegas, or parts of Idaho, are swimming pools. And while the saltwater is death, dragonflies and damselflies do pretty well in swimming pools. So colonizing swimming pools seems to be a really good strategy for Pachydipplex, which is, by the way, the most observed dragonfly on iNaturalist. It's got that record. And it's really expanding its range, but it's not that it's expanding really widely in terms of kilometers. It's just like within a city where it's found, it's now being found in a lot more urban areas because it's exploiting anything that humans put out.
Interesting. Right. A few people are asking how they can attract dragonflies to their yard. Or there specific plants they can put in the ground?
So dragonflies and damselflies, I would say, are not really picky about particular plants in North America. If the person who's asking that question is in Central or South America, I would say yes, you should plant bromeliad plants. Because any type of plant in Bromeliaceae, which are the things like pineapples, where the leaves, the bracts kind of collect water in them, there's a certain type of dragonfly and damselfly that will lay their eggs in, they're called phytotalms or tank plants. They lay their eggs in the water, and there's other insects that lay their eggs in the water. So that can be a really good strategy. But really, what you're doing is you're just introducing another water feature. So that is a plant that in itself is a water feature. Usually, what we would suggest is not necessarily worrying so much about the plants that you have, although dragonflies and damselflies do like to vary where they perch. So having things that are low plants, medium plants, and kind of high plants, that will allow different species that tend to like to perch high versus closer to the ground. But the most important thing, I think, is having fresh water. So either having like a small pond or a water, feature of some sort. Those can be really attractive. In Newark, New Jersey, my colleague put out, again, kiddie pools on the roof because he was going to try and grow some plants, and they were full of dragonflies. And a few weeks into the summer, like if you build it, they'll come. They just need water, fresh water.
That's amazing. All right, this next question, Cindy wants to know in terms of salt water. They see a lot of dragonflies at the beach where there's an abundance of salt and brackish water. What's up with that?
So I'm not sure where Cindy lives, but if Cindy lives in the eastern part of North America, it could be, and what you're seeing as a kind of a small dragonfly, there is actually the seaside dragonlet, Erythrodiplex bernice, which can develop in brackish water. But more commonly, what you're seeing when you're near the beach are things that are kind of, if they're very big, if they're greenish or bluish and they're very big, or if they're pentella, like the one that I was just talking about, they could be things that are just coming in, because those do migrate across the ocean and they're kind of coming in. But there's lots of other dragonflies that aren't what we call migratory, but that kind of fly along the coast of regions before going in towards finding fresh water. But when they're navigating, they tend to use the coastline as part of their guide. So it could be members of those genera or species, but most certainly they're not breeding in the saltwater. They're just kind of either coming in from having crossed the ocean or kind of using the coastline to navigate, unless they're the seaside dragonlet, in which case maybe they're actually doing that.
I love the diversity. So Taylor's younger brother, Ted, hi Ted, has a question. How do dragonflies communicate with each other?
That is a good question. It's mostly through color and signal. We don't think they can hear. So, and we don't think that you can hear their wings make noise, but we don't think they're doing that intentionally. They use color to kind of communicate, especially when males are trying to establish territories. They often will have color on their wings, and males will actually flash their wings like this. Well, because you can't really see it because I'm wearing a black sweater. I'll use it so you can see my tattoo. So they go like this. They will like kind of flash their wings like this so that they're flying, and then they flash the color that's on their wings and then continue flying and then flash the color. That can be a common way that they communicate, like, I'm here, I'm actually very big, and I'm going to hold this territory. Often the size of the color patch, and we see this in the ruby spot that you can find kind of across North America, Central and South America, with a red, kind of a damselfly with a red spot. The size of the color spot on their wing actually indicates the likelihood. It's a true signal of how likely a male is going to be able to hold a territory. So we think that these color patterns and like their success in the behavior really impacts their territoriality. In terms of other ways of communicating, females can communicate a signal in some damselflies, and the signal is, don't try and mate with me. And the way that they do that is by changing their coloration. It's a very unusual circumstance, and it only happens in a few species. But there are damselfly species where after a female has mated and we think she's stored her sperm, then she actually kind of changes her coloration to be the same color or similar color patterns as the male. So that then she gets confused as a male. And then she gets left alone. So she doesn't have the harassment of constantly being approached to try and mate. So that is a signal, right? That females are sending. The signal is, I'm not available to mate. But other than that, I would say they just kind of bump into each other and try and either eat each other or mate with each other at any moment.
All right, this next question a few people had about pesticides. Do pesticides impact dragonflies and damselflies?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So there are dragonflies and damselflies that, well, depending on so pesticides, that's a broad term, right? But there are certain insecticides that impact the same kind of calcium, potassium channels that dragonflies and damselflies have. And if you apply it to them, then they'll die. But I think a bigger impact perhaps on the day-to-day for them is just that they either are consuming insects because they're predators, top predators in most cases in the system. So they're consuming insects that may have been exposed to insecticides, or if insecticides have wiped out the food, then they don't have the food to eat at all, right? So those are ways that can negatively impact them. We as humans don't like having mosquitoes around. We don't like having black flies, and we don't like having horseflies. And so a lot of places will do kind of larvicide applications to try and prevent those that are developing also in freshwater. And that can negatively impact the nymphs because that is reducing the kind of food that's available to them. And there are some very specific target applications that they say don't impact odonates in terms of the nymphs, but I don't know that anyone's done a lot of testing on that. But we know at the very least it's reducing the food that's available to them. And they are the top predators. So if they eat things that have eaten, things that are toxic, then that affects them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sort of piggybacking on that, Scott was wondering, what do the nymphs of dragonflies and damselflies in the water eat?
What don't they eat? That's the question. They eat everything. They have because they're sit and wait predators, right? They'll just try for lots of things. So they'll eat minnows, like small fish. They'll eat tadpoles. They'll eat each other, of course. They'll eat mosquito larvae, lacewing, owlfly larvae. They'll eat caddisflies. They'll eat beetles. They'll eat anything that's in the water. They'll try for. And this is kind of true even for adults. They kind of suffer, I suppose, to anthropomorphize them with delusions of grandeur. So they try routinely to take down things that they seem to be too big. like, are you sure you want? Like, there's even a photo, which I mean, people say is real. I mean, ornithologists that I trust took this photo of a dragon hunter, Haginius, that had taken down a hummingbird as an adult, right? So I don't know that what happened after the photo was taken, but like they have a reputation for being very good at hunting, and it's in part because you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, Wayne Gretzky said, and they take all the shots, right? So as juveniles, as sit and wait predators, they strike. They have a very fast strike, and they strike at almost anything.
Wow, hummingbird. I'm gonna go look that up after this.
Yeah.
A few folks are mentioning mosquito dunks and if they kill dragonfly larvae or if they're safe.
Yeah, that is a very good question. So we don't, the short answer is we don't have enough information to really answer it. The people that I know several people who really advocate this for mosquito control, that have said that they really don't think it's going to have a negative impact. But I don't know an odontologist or an odontology study that's really done comparative, like looking across taxa in kind of flowing water and still water, like looking at different variables to really see the impact. So I guess I would say we don't have enough. I don't think we have enough data to answer that, but at the very least, mosquitoes are an important part of their diet, so they will lose the diet. I mean, my hunch is that the more we look, the more we're going to see that, like, yeah, well, someone should study that. I won't say my hunch, but someone should study that.
Right. Terry is wondering, they left part of Anomo May wild because there were a lot of light blue and red damselflies in the area. They
Yeah.
looked like they were on some plants that looked like wheat or rye. Is it possible that they use this as food? They have no water in their yard except for some bird baths.
No, they won't use that as food. So they never eat plants other than accidentally, because they'll try for anything. And sometimes as they're striking, they get food back that they didn't mean to, but they don't eat it intentionally. But they need to rest. So often, especially right after they emerge, even if the pond is a neighbor's pool or the one, if you have a local park and there's water there, they could fly from there. They can fly, some of them can fly quite a far distance, and they're just eating. Often they're on veg because there's other insects flying around the veg and they can eat. But they also are resting, so they have to rest, and they often go away from water to rest, because if they rest near the water, they're going to be constantly harassed by other individuals that want to mate, right? So when they want to rest, they usually go away from water.
Shavira is wondering if light pollution is a problem in South American countries.
Yeah, I'll take for Guyana as an example. Guyana is a country where I've been sampling and working with colleagues and collaborators there. The first time I went was in 1999, and there was almost no light after 5 p.m. in the interior. And then maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I guess, there was like a governmental initiative to bring light to all Guyanese people, so that everybody would have light. And it hasn't happened yet, but they've been slowly working on that. And of course, if you have light, people turn lights on. And so the most recent time I was there was in May, and there were clouds of mayflies kind of around the lights that were going, that would otherwise have been on the water, because we were near a river. And it definitely has an impact. We haven't really measured it. We do have a lot of good baseline data because this is all very new, that we're starting to see so much light in the Rupununi and the interior. So I guess there's more data to come, I guess, to really look at the impact. But my observation is that that lights are on basically from 5 p.m. until 11 p.m. constantly now at our field site, constantly. And that's new, just in the last 5 years. It would have been complete darkness.
Amy is wondering if you can talk about when and why dragonflies swarm. They seem to have had an annual event in their yard in late July.
Oh, nice. Well, if it's depends on the dragonfly. Sometimes people do get depending on where you live. Like if you lived in Long Island, for example, or in Cape May, New Jersey, I would say, oh yeah, maybe it's Pentella or Annex, because there actually are huge swarms that pass over there every year around that time. But more commonly, what you might see is there's a lot of activity. A lot of species are out in July and August. That's when, if you're in the northern hemisphere, that's when the species are most abundant. So you're just going to see more species out, and they tend to kind of come together, not because they're coming together, but because around they all have the instinct to do the same thing at the same time, which is to eat. So often in the late afternoon, in certain times of the day, they tend to kind of do what we call hawking behavior. So they're kind of flying above veg or a meadow or a lawn. If you have a lawn, there's lots of aerial plankton, aphids and mosquitoes and all sorts of stuff in the air around you, and they're just eating as they go. So it will look like they're together intentionally, but I think you almost certainly, unless it's the wandering glider or one of these migratory swarms, in which case you'd have more than a few, you'd have hundreds. But unless it's those, then they're probably all just there eating. You've just got a good yard that's got a lot of good insects, and they're eating, which is great.
Awesome. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Dawn is wondering, what frequencies of light do shadow dragons see?
Good question. I don't know. I guess I should know this, but I know that they have opsin families that are expanded that allow them to see kind of orange, red, and yellow light. So I guess the frequencies of orange, red, and yellow light are the ones that they would be most likely seeing. I'm a little uncertain. It's still really unclear what's happening with their vision, right? So we sequenced transcriptomes. We know this about the opsin pigments, which we in their eyes, the genes that we think are related for them to being able to see color. But that's actually not the whole story, right? There's very little histology that's been done to really understand the ommatidia in their eyes and what they're actually able to see. There's very little neurobiology that's been done to really understand the signaling, how they're processing the signal. So it might just be, I don't know that even our story really tells us what the true wavelengths are that they're capable of seeing, because we've only done it for one or two individuals. Again, from, Northern Ontario. So like there's actually a huge range. So we actually don't know that necessarily is universal across all the shadow dragons. There's I think still a lot to be done. I guess that's kind of the answer for all the dragonfly questions that anyone has, is there's still so much we don't know. So I don't really know the answer to that, like what the true breadth that they're able to see is. Yeah.
All right, Robert has an interesting question. What niche advantage does a damselfly have over a dragonfly and vice versa, if any?
That is a good question. Yeah, that is a good question. I don't know that they have a niche advantage necessarily. I mean, they have kind of partitioned their habitat. Dragonflies and damselflies do things very differently as adults. Dragonflies tend to fly higher up in the air column, although that's not always the case, and damselflies tend to fly lower in the air column, though that's not always the case. Dragonflies that tend to be perchers tend to perch on slightly different things than damselflies that tend to be perchers, which tend to perch on grasses, although that's not always, there's always exceptions. As juveniles, damselflies tend to be kind of moving around a bit more than dragonflies, but there are examples of damselflies that are just clingers, that are clinging to rocks, the same as a dragonfly. So they definitely are overlapping a little bit. They overlap a little bit in their diet, although what they're capable of consuming is different, because dragonflies tend to be larger than damselflies. They tend to be out in kind of similar seasons, similar time of day, similar habitats, because there's lentic and lotic for both. I don't know. I can't think of a particular niche advantage, and there's around the same number of species as in both groups, 3,000 to 3,000. So I don't know that really speaks to kind of like an evolutionary advantage that one has over the other in terms of species richness, as a reflection of evolutionary success. That is a good question. I mean, certainly there are groups that are in sympatry that are in the same small river or pond, but it tends to be that they've kind of really partitioned the microhabitat, with some things being little eddies along the edge of the bank and some things being kind of the middle of the water source. But whether or not one has an advantage over the other, I don't know that we could say that. That's a very good question. I really don't know that we have the information to suggest that. My guess would be, my hunch would be no. There's no advantage for either of them, and damselflies are just as likely to try and eat a dragonfly as dragonflies are to eat a damselfly.
All right, Alice is wondering, do purple martin colonies reduce dragon or damselfly numbers?
Oh, well, I mean, that is a good question. Certainly, I would, not just purple martins, but I mean, any bird kind of group that you have in an area, they're going to eat dragonflies and damselflies. We know that they're really important food source, we think, especially for migratory birds, but resident birds too. My hunch would be, if you had a population, that they would probably reduce the number of dragonflies and damselflies in your area. But I don't know that would necessarily, I mean, I guess it's a trade-off, right? Because having them around might also positively impact the habitat in other ways that would be beneficial for dragonflies and damselflies. But birds, fish, frogs, lizards, I mean, if I wanted a world where dragonflies were going to have unlimited success, all those animals would be gone because they're always eating dragonflies and damselflies at any water, field, desert, forest site that I'm at. But dragonflies and damselflies are they're usually they're quite good at evading predation. You know, that's we think that agility. If you look at the dragonflies that were the first flyers, they were really poor flyers, and you don't actually see the wing features in the wings that we think are related to agility and maneuverability until the rise of modern birds. And we think that modern birds really, like mid-Cretaceous, is when flight got really good at dragonflies and damselflies so that they could avoid being eaten. So your purple martins probably, was it purple martins or buntings? I forget what you said, but whichever bird it was, they probably miss dragonflies at least some of the time because dragonflies are quite good. They're really fast and they have a very short turning radius, so they can turn on a dime.
All right, 2 more questions here. Kelly is wondering, is there much known about dragonfly hearing capabilities?
Yeah, there is a bit known, and what we know is that they don't have any. So the reason why I say it that way is because what about the shadow dragons? Right? Like somehow they can sense when the bats are there. We think, as we just were talking about, that they're not necessarily seeing everything, although we don't really know a lot about their vision. But when bats or other, like myself with a dragonfly net, are flying around, like swinging it around, or when bats are swooping down, they do this behavior where they like drop to the surface of the water, like 1 centimeter above the water, maybe even less, a couple, 9 millimeters or something like that. And they fly erratically like this. And then they change the height in the air column that they're flying really dramatically, right? So what is the cue for them to do that? Is it just that they're able to see in really low light? Or is it that they're able, I mean, we know they can sense vibration. Like, is it that we actually, the reason why I guess I don't want to say like, what we know in the literature is that they don't have any hearing. But I wonder, I hold out skepticism and like optimism that maybe the more people look at things that do unusual behavior, like shadow dragons, maybe we'll find that they actually are able to sense some additional things. Whether it's true hearing or not, I don't know. But they seem to be using some clues that don't seem to be just chemosensory, because we can look at their antennae and they don't have any more sensory pits, than other dragonflies. So they're somehow detecting these bats. When we play songs of bats or calls of bats to them, they don't really respond. So that kind of is evidence to suggest that they aren't hearing them, but maybe there's some other thing that they're sensing.
Yeah. More research needed.
And more will be revealed, my friend says. More will be revealed.
Definitely. Well, I lied. We have 2 more questions. I apologize. Mary is wondering, they use BTI, which is used to prevent mosquitoes in water features / sources. Does that negatively affect dragonflies?
So some of the formulations that you can get are very specific, right? Just for Lepidoptera or just for Diptera. And in that case, it shouldn't necessarily have a target impact on odonates. But of course it will. I mean, if the odonates are in your water feature, they need to have something to eat. So there has to be some insects that are allowed to survive in the water. Whether or not that's beetles or mosquito larvae is kind of your choice, I guess. But there needs to be, if you want them to develop to the adult stage, either they're just going to eat each other, in which case only a few of them are going to become adults, right? Because they will have eaten each other, or you need to have food in them for, there needs to be other insects that are allowed to lay their eggs in there and develop so that they can be food for the dragonflies.
All right, we're going to end on this last question, which I really appreciate. Do you have a favorite kind of dragonfly or damselfly, and which one would you choose?
That is a good question. So I always feel like I have to say the same answer for dragonfly because I named my daughter Aishna after Aishna canadensis. So now if I don't say, I feel guilty if I don't say that one as my favorite. But my favorite damselfly maybe is this one, Calopteryx. It has a metallic green body, and it has, it's called the ebony jewel wing, and it has black wings. So if you live in Europe, there's a similar version of this called Calopteryx virgo. Or if you live in North America, then you can see Calopteryx maculata, and it's a very, very pretty damselfly.
Oh, that's amazing. That's a very beautiful name. Well, thank you, Jessica, so much. And thanks to our audience for all these wonderful questions. You're getting lots of love in the chat from
Oh,
people
thank
just
you.
learning so much and really just appreciating this topic. So thank you again for joining us. And for those of you who listen to Bug Banter, our podcast, Jessica did come and join Matthew Shepard and I there. And that will come out in 2 Tuesdays from this week. So thank you again, Jessica, for your time and your expertise and your experience. It's been really wonderful learning from you today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and let's all focus on aquatic insects too, because they need our love. So,
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.